Please welcome Michael Specter.
Thank you. I'm remarkably low tech. If I close this computer, will anything bad happen? I'm not sure. Okay. I'm not going to risk it. I think I'm going to try to be annoying enough just as it is. So. Actually, it's daunting to talk to this group because I usually talk to people who come with Molotov cocktails. And I thought last night, gee, I might just be speaking to the converted. But I was then, Barry assured me that there will be people who hate me. So I'm hoping for that. And it's the least we can do. And it's kind of crazy that I'm here at all. I mean, when you looked at those slides and you saw the things people were going nuts about 30, 40 years ago, you would think that things have gotten better because we are more sophisticated than we ever have been. We do more scientifically. Our progress moves by the second, not by the hour, the day, or the year. And it's actually kind of breathtaking what we are able to do in almost any area of science, from what seems like a trivial thing. I could download any song anyone here could name on a telephone, to editing DNA, which is both wonderful and scary, and we'll be having lots of talks about that, though not today. But GMOs are something that I have been trying not to write about for 20 years. And I'm not very good at not doing it because every time I try to stop, something so horrific happens that I just sort of feel compelled. And it's now our society has adopted a view of these organisms as if they are some Martian-like different species. I was actually, I have a house in the Hudson Valley, and I teach at Bard in the fall. I teach a course on the future of food and how to feed the world. And there's a movie theater in Great Barrington, and I went to it a couple weeks ago, and there's a new cafe next to it. I went in to get some iced tea, and this former student of mine, who I hadn't seen in a long time, came running up, hugs, how are you? And then she looked at me and said, Michael, you know this is an organic cafe, don't you? And I'm like, yeah, but she made it seem like I was behind enemy lines. And I felt like I was lucky to get out of there with unpoisoned tea. The truth is, these distinctions, organic, natural, local, mostly they're ludicrous. I grow organic food. I am a rich guy. If tomatoes fall off my vine and rot, or if I have a bad year, then I just have fewer tomatoes or I go buy tomatoes. That's not the problem that most people around the world face. And the problem that we have, I think the central problem, and I'll begin with that, is the view of GMOs that has been put forth, and this is by everyone, though not the press, because the press is blameless, as you all know, and we never exaggerate, is that genetically modified organisms are products that can cure terrible problems in the world. And we can make the environment better, and we can make people eat who can't eat now, and we can do it healthfully and cheaply. And mostly what we've seen with GMOs, and I am a proponent, is there's GMO corn, and there's GMO soybean, and there's GMO cotton. And they're really good for farmers. And you could make the argument, I would, that they're good for other people too. But they're not saving everyone's lives. They're not special oils. They're not vitamins that kids in Africa don't have, that if they would just swallow 1 grain of it, then they'd be better. And so I once interviewed a guy about 15 years ago in London who said, you know, if the first 2 products of electricity were the electric chair and the cattle prod, people might think differently about electricity. And not that these things are like that, but the truth is there's a big disconnect between what has been sold and continues to be sold and reality. The truth is that these are wonderful products. They are tools in a quiver, an arrow, and we're going to need all of them because, and I'm sure many of you know these statistics, but in the next 30, 40, 45 years, we're going to have to grow more food than we have grown in all of human history. And we're not, and maybe you also know this, organic food requires more land, it requires more water, meat requires more land, it requires more space. Animals eat grain. We don't have arable land left on this planet. So what's happening now is the two great countries that are growing rapidly and moving into the middle class with blinding speed are India and China. And I don't know why, I'm not a psychologist, but when people start getting rich, they start eating like us. Because I guess they also start getting stupid when they start getting rich. But what that means is they eat a lot of meat. So the fastest growing McDonald's in the world are in China and India. And a lot of meat is a lot of land, and it's a lot of grain, and it's a lot of water in places that can't afford it. No place can afford it, but those places, India relies on the monsoon. Bad year, people starve. Good year, people make it. That is what they're looking at. But what GMOs really can do, they are not being allowed to do because there's something called vitamin A rice. Hundreds of thousands of kids go blind every year in the developing world because they don't have vitamin A. Interestingly, if you go into a health food store in the United States, which no one should ever do, but if you're like on a drug or something and you wander in, every one of the bottles in the health food store will tell you that its product is good for vitamin A. It supports vitamin A health in the terminology that is allowed by the FDA. And that's great because supporting vitamin A health is wonderful. No one has a vitamin A deficiency in the United States, and no one, and by no one I mean no one, like 0 people. Out of 330 million is a very low number. So the fact that they are advertising this as a benefit should tell people where we're at. In the developing world, what we have is quite the opposite. And 15 years ago, a guy named Ingo Petroikis, who is a Swiss scientist, developed a way to engineer vitamin A into a grain of rice. And it expresses beta-carotene, and it looks gold, like a carrot, or orangish gold. And it's called golden rice. And for 15 years, people have been trying to plant this in test plots, see if it works, because it would be just so wonderful in a place where rice is the basic foodstuff for people to be able to eat it. So far, nowhere. The only place they've really been able to plant it as a test is in the Philippines, and it's been ripped up and burned down about 4 times. In India, it's been banned. In many countries of Africa, because the forces of people like Vandana Shiva and Greenpeace who say, these things are evil because they're not natural, have managed to convince people that something that's completely natural shouldn't be allowed to be grown. And then what you have are lies. So at the beginning, like everything else, when a flat screen TV came out, it probably cost $5,000. You can probably get it now for $500. Well, the first vitamin A rice, you would have had to eat 200 pounds of it to get enough vitamin A into you for it to be of use. That obviously is of no value. Today, what you need to do is eat 2 large tablespoonfuls. And that is nothing, and that's what kids eat, and it can be grown cheaply. And yet, this is an example, and it's only the most visible example. There's tons of products that have been developed by scientists, developed by nonprofits that, and close your ears, I'm about to say a horrible word, that have nothing to do with Monsanto. And you can, and I happen to like Monsanto because I'm that kind of guy. But these things have nothing to do with them. Monsanto has nothing to do with it. These are public domain, intellectually available pieces of knowledge that can help. And yet nowhere except they just planted some brinjal, which is eggplant, in Bangladesh, and just a very little amount of it. And what that means, by the way, is that the people who plant the GMO brinjal, it has engineered into it a bacterium that will kill pests. So they don't need to use this spray that we've always used everywhere and is an insecticide and is poisonous. And they've gone from sort of maybe 1 to 2 sprayings per week to 1 to 2 per season. In India and in China, this has happened with cotton, and you've seen the results. You've seen poisonings go like that. You've seen benefits for water, for things like women get to go home earlier and be with their kids because they are the people who usually do the spraying. Don't know how that happened, but you know, when there's poison, it's not going to be the boys who do it. What frustrates me about all this is that we can't seem to move forward with the knowledge. It is not enough to be armed with facts. I was recently somewhere where a cousin of mine who's very smart got a doctorate, went back to school and got a PhD recently, and I had seen her and congratulated her, and we talked, and she had said some things about, some nice things about some things I had written, and she said, but this thing with the GMOs, this is why you're wrong. I said, okay, I have a couple hours. The Terminator seed, there's just no way you can justify Terminator seeds. Okay, 2 things. I can justify them, and more importantly, they don't exist. And they've never existed. And if you don't know what a Terminator seed is, in the 1990s, a company called Delta Pine and Land developed a patent that said, gee, we have these GMO products, and it's kind of like software. It's an intellectual property. We want to sell it. But we don't want, it's like Microsoft Word, we don't want you to be giving it to your neighbor, and we don't want you to use it again and again. You want to use it next year, buy it again. And you can argue about whether that's appropriate or not, and I'll be happy to, because it's mixed. But they developed this, and some very smart activists in Canada figured out a name for it, which was the Terminator seed. Dun, 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 dun. And it was excellent. It was, I think, at the time that the first Terminator movie came out. Right at that time, as if by cue, Monsanto decided it would buy this company. So activists went crazy, and it became very emotional, very angry, and Gordon Conway, who was then the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, is a brilliant man, one of the finest ecologists alive, basically negotiated a settlement with Monsanto, and so that they actually came out in 1998 with a written statement saying, we have never tried to make a Terminator seed. We will never make a Terminator seed. We will never market a Terminator seed. Oh, and by the way, we've decided not to buy this company. That was 17 years ago. Nothing has changed. No one has ever made a Terminator seed, yet intelligent people constantly tell me that one of the reasons that GMOs are so terrible is because Terminator seeds means that poor people can't save seeds and get free seeds, particularly terrible in India. Okay, I really don't, even after all these years, I don't know where to start. First of all, everyone in India is entitled by law to keep and replant seeds, sell seeds, buy seeds, give seeds to whomever they want in any way whatsoever, except they can't rebrand seeds that they've bought from some manufacturer and sell them that way. Okay, it's clear as day. Here's the more controversial thing. People get upset. One of the reasons they get upset about GMOs is they say, it's going to blow into, the pollen will blow into a field and it'll contaminate my nice natural stuff. By the way, a few weeks ago I was in a hardware store in New York and I saw an ad for natural rat poison. So, this whole natural thing is great. But that is a theoretical concern. There are really good ways to prevent that, but sometimes farmers don't do what they should. Wouldn't it be great if someone could invent a way where you could plant a crop and everyone who hated the crop could know for a certainty that they would never have their crops infected by it because the seed wouldn't reproduce? We could develop one of those things, and it would be great for the environment, except that this is what that is, and somehow the movement led by Greenpeace, which I lived in Russia a long time. I'd much rather have the communist leadership then than Greenpeace now running anything. But they have decided this is evil, and it's evil, and that's all there is to it. And so we live in a country, you've probably seen this, I was in Boston last week. You walk by a Chipotle. In the window, they have goodbye to GMOs. Yay! They're banning GMOs from all their products. And they're so proud. And any person, any farmer, any restaurant, any organization should have the right to make and sell whatever he or she wants. Fine with that. You don't want to buy GMO products, don't buy them, though I'll get into why that's more difficult than you think. But to have become a country that is super excited at being able to advertise that we are slinking into ignorance is really, it's just quite sad because, again, we've been modifying our food for 10,000 years. This is nothing new. It's a more precise way to do it, and there are many greater benefits. There are also some risks. There are risks, and you'd be a fool not to notice it. Nothing is without risk, and that is the biggest problem in terms of inquiry that we face, because people will say, I hate to mention this word, but there's a risk. I live in Brooklyn most of the time. We're a bunch of overeducated people with too much money, raise too many children with really big strollers. And I've had these arguments all the time, and they don't want to vaccinate their kids. These are not illiterate people, these are Yale graduates. It's the rich people. The worst place for this is Vashon Island. It's a rich island off Seattle. It's got like a 42% vaccination rate because people say there's a risk. There's a risk. There's a risk to vaccinating your child. There's a risk to eating GMO foods. I cannot promise anyone that next Tuesday, everyone who's ever eaten a GMO food, that their right arm won't fall off. It could. We could die. We could get cancer. All I can say is that in 30 years of eating GMO foods, after trillions of doses have been consumed, the number of cases that have been demonstrably shown to have made people sick is zero. Zero. Zero out of trillions. Again, we don't do the math. We don't do numerators and denominators. We say there's a risk. If it's 1 out of 3, that's a risk. If it's 1 out of like 3 trillion, maybe we should worry about who's going to win the Cavaliers-Warriors series. Because that we don't make those distinctions. So that's true with vaccines. It's true with so many things. And we believe that natural is good. Natural is perfect. I'm not speaking to you guys to enrich myself, and I've said this many times in places where I was enriching myself. I'm happy to give my speaker's fee to anyone, anywhere, who can give me a coherent, legal, intellectually rational, and correct definition of natural. Do it. Because I don't know what it is. Because you got the natural rat poison. So, when people like Vandana Shiva talk about things are natural, what they're really talking about is they're being done the way they've always been done. And we can no longer afford to grow food the way we always have grown food. Now, it would be a fool who could stand here before you and say, and we're doing a great job in this country because we're making 1/3 of our people obese. We're basically manufacturing empty calories, And we're making it so easy for people to eat crap and so hard for them to eat something else. And lots of the people in Berkeley in the Hudson Valley, one of which is the place I live in, their solution to all this stuff is everyone should eat more home food. They should cook. They should have Brussels sprouts. I agree, I like Brussels sprouts, I cook. That's not solving the problem for about 240 million people, and money matters. So as long as someone's a harried person who has kids, is trying to get home, who needs food, doesn't have time, and doesn't have a lot of money, they're gonna buy what's available, what's convenient, and what's cheap. And that will never change. And those things right now suck. They're really bad for you. Now, there's a movement afoot to make cheap fast food that is good for you. I'm looking into this now. Right now, I suspect it's mostly cheap fast food for rich people. But I don't know that for a fact, and I think there's some people out there who really want to try. And again, sure, the answer is do a better job of educating your kids. The one thing I made my kid learn when she doesn't do physics and she can't count to 10, but she can cook. You don't need to count to 10. It's really not that useful because you have a calendar. I once asked her, like, do you remember what your Aunt Sylvia's phone number is? She said, yeah, it's 3. Because it's just like, okay, no problem. Problem solved. Modern world is great. So I could go on, and I'll go on a little bit longer, but I just feel that we've perverted our goals to such a degree. I wrote a story a couple years ago about dengue fever. Dengue fever is really bad. It's something you don't want to get. It doesn't usually kill people, but it's very painful and there's no cure. And it's getting worse. It's getting worse for a couple reasons. Climate change is one. Another one is that the used tire market in the world is very successful. And Aedes aegypti mosquitoes like to mate and have sex in the little water pools inside of used tires. And so billions are shipped around the world, and the mosquitoes go with them. So we're seeing these mosquitoes where we never saw them before. One place it's really bad is Brazil. So these guys from Oxford, actually I think 2 of them were students of Dawkins, entomologists, said, what they're doing now to deal with this is dumping a lot of chemicals in people's backyards. There are dangers to that. Let's modify a mosquito so that when it mates, the eggs from the female develop without wings and they all die. And if we did that enough, that would be the end of those mosquitoes in this area. And Aedes aegypti happened to be one type of mosquito that you can get rid of without worrying about a cascading problem of what is the effect on society and on other animal life. They're invasive anyway. They were never in this hemisphere. So they did that in Brazil, and it's working really well. I went down there. The experiment was great. Now they're doing it in a bigger way. Suddenly, Key West has the problem. They get some dengue. And the Oxitec guys say, hey, let's go talk to Key West. And the person who runs the health department there is an ex-CDC employee, and he's cursed by being rational. Bad thing to be. So I went there the day that Oxitec presented to Key West. Key West is, some of you have been there, it's a beautiful community filled with the sort of, the prosperous people who like to pretend they're still in the 60s but drive Lexuses and stuff. And it's mellow, it's overly mellow, but it's a very pleasant place. And dengue in a place like Key West is very bad because Key West has one industry, tourism. I'm not taking my family to a place where they're gonna get dengue. I'll just go to I'll go to the Caribbean where they don't have it. I mean, there's millions of places you can go and not have that particular risk. So if dengue is a problem, Key West has a problem. So these Oxitec guys said, they got up there and they presented their data, which is very compelling. And I admit, the idea of making a thing that can fly around changing its genetics, it's fundamentally scary. There's no question about it. Couple things to know. A mosquito lives 7 days, like a super long-lived mosquito lives 10 days. If you're a great world traveler as an Aedes aegypti flying around, you fly 100 meters. So what this means is it's really easy to cordon off a sort of 300-meter square place to do a trial and see if it works. So it's not like Jurassic Park, though it is understandable. I think it's understandable to be concerned. When they presented this, the citizenry of Key West stood up as one and went berserk, accused them of being like Monsanto, evil multinationals who are trying to come in and sell them their product. Because there's nothing worse than selling a product. I mean, I hate Apple for doing that. And it was really bitter, it was really personal. These are just guys, they're entomologists. They're just smart guys from Oxford University. Sure, they probably want to make money, but that wasn't their main thing. And who cares if it was? These guys screamed them out of town because they would rather do what they're now doing. They would rather dump DuPont chemicals in all their backyards all the time than consider something different. Because we are so afraid of change that, oh, DuPont, you may be horrible in other instances, but I'd much rather have you than a thing that causes no harm, for which there are no chemical involvement, no cancers, no poisoning the groundwater, nothing. Just, they wouldn't even consider having a trial of it. And you certainly shouldn't do this without lots of trials. But to not have a trial of some of the oils they have in India, that if people had them, it would lower cholesterol in a country that has obesity problems. It would fight, I mean, we could use it too, but forget it. There are so many wonderful products out there that we cannot even get people to test, let alone try. And that's because the world of, the rich world that sort of defines the whole food mindset, feels like we're somehow doing something wrong when we use these products. And by the way, I'm just going to end on this because it's not as depressing as I usually am. I teach this course at Bard, and the first thing I say on the first day to the kids is, how many of you try to avoid consuming GMOs at all costs? Everyone's hand goes up. I've done it 5 times. Like 2 kids out of 100 have kept their hands down, and I think they were just brown nosers. So at the end, I say, fine, that's good. And then I just sit down and I talk to them for 10 minutes about vitamin A rice. And do you think it would be good if kids could not go blind? Do you think this would be good if it wasn't risky? It was like regular rice. And everyone loves that. So I say, okay, so now we're all pro-GMO. We just, for the next 3 months, we can work out the details. And I tell you this because I think a lot of what this is going on is when people say they're anti a product, they're anti-Monsanto, or they're anti-monopoly, or they're anti a certain type of pesticide use that they don't know enough about. And some of those things are legitimate, but they all have solutions. There's philosophical solutions, there's political solutions, there's patent law solutions. If you think Monsanto has too much of a market, in Europe, they're suing Google now for having too much of a market, and Google gives its products away. There's not one Google product you have to use. You don't like Gmail, you think they have too much of your information, use something else. There's nothing. But it is true that with Monsanto, they actually sell their products. If you think there's a patent problem, we know how to resolve those problems in this country and in other countries, but people don't want to do it. So I guess my thing is, we have to stop, and I'm as guilty as anyone, of sort of saying the science, which I haven't spoken about much, but it's very powerful and overwhelmingly the case that data supports the fact that GMOs, the use of genetically modified products, are the same as any other product. And in many cases, it relieves a lot of use of insecticides. And in some cases, there are herbicides that you use more. And people will say, you use 26 times more herbicide now that you're doing this Roundup corn. That's true, and it's a problem, and it's particularly a problem if you have a monoculture where you just grow a lot of one thing, which you shouldn't do whether it's GMO or not. But the 26 times more thing is an interesting statistic because Roundup replaced 2 other drugs that are 900 to 1,100 times more toxic. So 26 times is still, I don't know, you do the math, 70, 80, 90 times less than they were using before, and they're using less of it. So I don't think these things are nothing. But I think when we say we are opposed to genetically modified organisms, we're opposed to big business, or we're opposed to what we think we know about what it does to the environment. And I'm not opposed to big business, but it's fine to be opposed to big business. There's lots of ways to express that. Some of these companies have stopped using GM products. Okay, that's their right, and it's the right of people to decide to buy those or not buy those. But let's not do this by pretending that something is dangerous that isn't, because there are so many things that are dangerous out there, and we have the ability to address them. Let's do that. Let's focus on that, but not arrogantly dismiss the antis, but ask them just why. It's much easier in the food world, I think, than the vaccine world. Because the vaccine thing, it's a very emotional, purely emotional, my baby thing. And on some level, I get it, but it's very harmful. With the food thing, it's almost always a misconception, and you can usually talk to people, and we don't do that because we're too busy being angry that they're so stupid. We are among friends. No tweeting, no recording, no memorizing. And that's a problem, and it's a problem that I've faced in the past. In my book, I was incredibly harsh on this subject, and that was after one of the best editors at the New Yorker read the chapter and said, let's have a cup of coffee. And this piece I wrote about Vandana Shiva last year was much more measured. She's still trying to sue us. That's fine. It's what we do. But I guess my big point here is you gotta educate, you gotta reason, you gotta care. But it's never gonna do any good, because I've been doing this a long time, to get into the science is right, you're a Luddite, and we're going to all starve if we don't do this stuff. Because that's not going to make anyone change their mind. And also overselling it and saying, we're gonna wave a wand and everything will be better. It won't be. But it'll be a little better, and there's 27 other techniques that'll be better. There's no question we can feed the world no matter how rapidly it's growing. No, there's no question. I don't know any scientist who doesn't think that's true. But it's gonna require some effort, and it's gonna require some acknowledgement that we're running out of water, that climate change is an actual problem, as opposed to one that Congress thinks is a theoretical problem, and that we need to deal with all of it together. But we can. So that's it for me, but I think there's time for questions or yelling if anyone has any. Thank you. As always, I wrote a speech and I didn't give one word of it. I don't know why I do it. It happens to me all the time, but it's the gist. Hey.
I've enjoyed reading your articles for quite some time now.
Thank you, that's kind of you.
One of the very strong subtexts that a lot of people don't talk about, to me, in the anti-GMO argument is there's a subtext that farmers are stupid hicks and don't understand they're being ripped off by Monsanto.
You're totally
and
right.
I'm sorry, farmers make more weighty financial decisions than anybody else I can think, any profession I can think of. Every year is a test of a financial hypothesis.
You won't get any argument from me. They also care more than most people about the health of their fellow humans for a number of reasons, one of which is if they're dead, they can't sell their product. But also because they're good people. It takes a special person to be a farmer. It's not an easy thing to do. But I agree with you.
Hey, sir, you think you can get any mileage out of using a medical analogy? For example, pointing out to people that bacterial meningitis is perfectly natural. Semi-synthetic antibiotics are not.
I've tried. I mean, insulin is a GMO. I've never seen anyone protest the use of insulin. I've never seen anyone go around saying, oh my God, that guy has a pig valve in his heart. He's going to have sex with someone else. They're going to have a baby and it's going to be like half pig. No, but I've never seen that problem. And the reason, I think, is because when something is demonstrably useful to someone, they get it. The problem with the corn stuff and the soybean stuff is I can explain why I think it's useful, but it doesn't you don't go home and say, oh my God, we developed GMO corn. Phew. If we develop a type of oil where your doctor says you need to put this oil in everything you eat instead of avoid it, and it brings down cholesterol and reduces saturated fat and things like that, I think people would feel differently. But I've tried I'm open to anything that I've tried. Yes?
Hi. I want to thank you for your presentation today. And I want to compliment the organization on all of the things they're talking about. I recently saw an excellent documentary which premiered at Sundance, and I was happy to get in my small town of Columbia, Missouri, and saw last week. It's called Merchants of Doubt, and some of the people in this room are in the film. It's an excellent film. It links together everything from climate change to GMOs, and if anyone has the opportunity to see it, I certainly hope they clamor and go see it. So thank you very much.
I will second that. It's a really well-made and thoughtful documentary, and you should try to get it. And if any of you are teachers, you should try to shove it down your students' throats, as I will do this year.
Hi. With your research on GMOs, do you believe there are certain foods that would be more hazardous if tampered with chemicals, or do you believe that there's really no danger generally, or what is your case on that?
Well, the first thing is you need to test every different product differently, because they do have theoretical dangers. At one time, they were testing using 2 amino acids from a Brazil nut in soybean. And that would be much better to feed pigs. It would be much more efficient. They'd grow faster. It would be cheaper. Except that people look on labels for nuts because some people are allergic to nuts, even Brazil nuts. You wouldn't have known that you were eating Brazil nuts. And this was caught by the company that did it, a company called Mon something. And it never got out of the lab. But it certainly theoretically could, and by the way, our FDA is a little more vigilant than some others in other places in the world. So I don't think it's biochemically true that some of these things make sense and some don't, but I think you can always make combinations that could cause problems and things you don't necessarily foresee. I think it's definitely the case that needs to be always considered.
I would like you to please say something about the connection between hostility to GMOs and the lack of understanding of biology in general and evolution in particular. Because when I argue with people about this, I often find that really the root of their opposition is that they're vitalists. You know, the stuff of life is sacred and it can't be tampered with, and they go on about species barriers and stuff like that. So, is there anything useful you could give us to address that problem?
Yeah, I think we need, first of all, many, many people, including well-educated ones, think that the chicken they eat at dinner was born wrapped in cellophane. we don't have a sense of how animals live. And partly that's because we treat them so badly for the most part. But I took my kid a couple years ago, she's a college student, to a place I get eggs, and I have a picture of her getting an egg as it came out of a chicken, and literally you would think she discovered fire. Because eggs just come out of chickens like that? And she'll come to my place upstate and she'll say, you just put these things called kale in the ground and they just grow up and you eat them? I'm like, yeah, we've been doing that for 10,000 years or more. But I think the evolutionary thing is important, and just to give people a sense that we're on a continuum and that there's nothing we do now that we didn't do or didn't grow out of before. And if you look, and as a molecular biologist, people would know this, we're related to I'm related to an elephant, the ancestor of an elephant that lived 50 million years ago, and that can be demonstrated. And people, this gets into the whole creationist stuff, which I didn't write about in my book, but it's a big problem. I mean, half of this country believes that angels are real. And I decided not to write about it because two things. I thought Mr. Dawkins probably could handle that himself. And also I just felt like I wanted to deal with these issues that weren't, to me, as cut and dried. I was probably wrong, it isn't cut and dried. But I think just simply walking people through the development of humanity, the development of crops, letting them know that, gee, we have basically made everything we eat. We've modified it. They've been bred. There were no Christmas trees in the Garden of Eden. There were no cantaloupes. There were no raspberries. We made everything. If we didn't eat corn, if we didn't raise corn, there'd be no corn. People don't know that. So the whole natural, non-natural thing is a real problem that has to be addressed slowly but carefully. Hi.
Hi. When someone who is usually rational comes out with something and I don't know the answer, it bugs me. And so I listened to Tom Hartman on the radio, and he's usually rational, but he went on this rant about GMOs. And he said, well, what they're doing is they're growing wheat that is resistant to Roundup. So they just plant it and they don't worry about the weeds, and then they spray everything with Roundup. And so what you're doing is encouraging the use of more Roundup. So I'd like to hear your answer to that.
That's true. But it's true in a context. I mean, Roundup-ready products are embedded with a bacterium, so that if you dump a bunch of Roundup around, it will kill everything but the stuff that it's protected. So mostly what it's killing are weeds that you would be killing in other ways, and it's not a harmful product. The problem with it is if you use it wrong. I've been out to farms in Indiana where there are 10,000 acres of corn, and not GMO corn, and they use Roundup, and it's wrong because you should be alternating crops. There are ways to grow crops so that they protect each other, because otherwise you are going to get resistance. That's evolution is very clear. All we are is an arms race. And every time you develop something, some bug or some virus or some entity is going to figure out a way to beat it. And then you got to develop something new. And that's why AIDS treatments, the ones that works, TB treatments, they're not a drug. They're 3 drugs at once because they make it possible to evade this process. So he's being hyperbolic, but technically he's right. The thing to do is people need to understand how to use these products. It's easy to understand, and actually mostly in America they do, but overseas that's a big problem. In India it's a problem. Okay, I think I have time for one more question, which is convenient, because there's one more question.
So, love the talk. I also loved your article on Dr. Oz. That was fantastic.
Dr. Oz. He just hired a fact checker yesterday, and wait, it gets better. The fact checker is a well-known anti-GMO activist. If he gave a shit, he would go to the New Yorker. We have the best fact checkers. He would just hire one of them away. He has a lot of money, and just give him a lot of money, and they would. Anyway, did you have a question?
Yeah. So I'm from Canada, and the one thing that confuses me often. I mean, I can understand the sort of run-of-the-mill people who get into the anti-GMO movement, but there's people like David Suzuki, who's considered like a national hero in Canada, who takes some stands on these topics that are more akin to the anti-GMO side. And there's also large bodies of scientific organizations like the Union for Concerned Scientists that sometimes takes anti-GMO stances, and those are the ones that confuse me of like how to deal with that.
Confuse you. First of all, there aren't large bodies. There's large body. And the Union for Concerned Scientists is a ludicrous organization. And it's filled with people who don't do their jobs. So I'm not saying there aren't legitimate reasons to be anxious about anything, but there's no legitimate reason to listen to them. And by the way, the National Academy of Sciences, I can list 17 scientific organizations in this country, and the Academy of Sciences in France, the Royal Society in England, in Australia, in Russia, in Germany. Every society with serious science that has looked at this problem has come out with the same result. So, you know, there are going to be outliers. There are going to be people who are going to tell you what they tell you, and we're never going to erase it all, just most of it, I hope, or some of it. Anyway, whatever you take away from this talk, the concerned scientists aren't concerned about science. I don't know what they're concerned about. But anyway, thank you very much. You guys are great.